Okay, so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be working a little bit with Racket and figuring out, well, how exactly does a language work. So here we go. First off, Racket is a language where you first make, well, here, this is your definitions window right here, and this is your interactions window. So you type in some definitions here, and then you can just interact with them over here. So for instance, if you look here, I've defined useful as a constant to be 30. So if over here I type in useful, it's going to give me back 30. So I should probably run this because the definitions have changed. Let me just take care of that. So, one sec. Everything else looks good. Okay, sorry about that. So if I run this again, everything's fine. And then I've also defined this function multiply. So if I type in multiply 3 and 4, I should get back 12. Okay? And here's the thing, it's not just these functions that you've defined that can be run inside of your interactions window. There's a lot of other functions that Racket has as well. So if you actually do plus 3 and 4, Racket recognizes that as something that works. So, and you can see that it gives us a 7. Essentially, what you want to do here is define everything that you're going to need and then interact with it over here. Alternatively, you could just do something like this. Multiply 3 and 4. And since this is a function call, it's going to produce a value. Racket is literally going to say, okay, well, this is not a definition, it's a production of a value, and I'm going to give that value back. So if we run this, it gives us a 12. Okay? So that's the basics of Racket. When you define something, you're adding it to a list of things that Racket knows how to deal with, and then you can work with that inside of the definition or inside of the interactions window. On the other hand, if you just place a command over here, Racket is still going to run it, and everything's going to be fine. As in, like, it's going to run it and produce that value on the screen when you run it. Okay? A third type, this is more of a special language teach pack kind of thing. Just so that you know, I'm working with beginning student with list abbreviations. You might be working with beginning student, but the list abbreviations make it kind of weird to work with, so I'm just going to go with list abbreviations. So, essentially, there's a special function check expect, and you can use it to make sure that your functions are doing what you want them to do. So in this case, I know that this should give me a 12, and if I run this, Racket gives me a very nice feedback, hey, the test passed. So this is really the only other kind of function that sort of exists in Racket teach packs that gives a different kind of output. So to sum everything up, definitions, they add to the list of things that Racket knows how to interact with. Expressions like this, where there's no definition but you're just calling something that already exists, Racket is going to run that and put that out here as part of running your program, running your definitions window. And finally, a check expect, a special kind of thing for the teach pack, lets you know in a different kind of font that the test passed. And it's specific to teach packs. So now that we know how to work, well, what the difference between definitions and different kinds of things that we can do with Racket are, we should look a little bit more closely at the actual definitions. So if we look here, there's a constant and then there's a function. Let me just make this a little bit bigger. I sort of realized that. So over here, when we're defining a constant, it's a special sort of syntax. What you're doing is you're binding the value 30 to useful. So useful is just a name, a keyword now, and you're giving it the value 30. So now this is being added to the list of constants Racket knows. Another constant that Racket knows, I believe, is pi. So if you do this, it recognizes pi. And like we showed before, it also recognizes useful. So that's one kind of definition. The second kind of definition is define a function. So here, this is a little bit different. If you were to put this all in one line, in technicality, we're still assigning one thing For instance, here we defined useful, that's one argument, and 30, that's a second argument. So these are two parameters to the define keyword. It's the same thing over here. There are two parameters for the define keyword. There's this, that's the first argument, and then there's this is the second argument, and then it closes off the entire thing. So what's the difference? Well, here we're defining a function, and we know this because we're putting it in brackets. This sort of special notation indicates, well, we're going to define this bracket multiply xy to be times xy. And how it all works is when you do a little bit more of Racket, you'll realize that if you're ever going to be putting a bracket on the left-hand side, you know that you're going to be calling a function. Because if I ever want to do anything, whatever I type right now should be a function. I can't just type 3 because this doesn't make any sense. There has to be something that does something to a different thing. For instance, I can type in, add, I can do plus 3 and 4, right? Instead of doing something like 3 plus 4, or 3 plus 4. The idea is that Racket always looks for the function right here. The function has to be the first thing that happens after a bracket. There really can't be anything else. Of course, there can be later on as we get into the language, but this is what's going to be happening. Okay? So that's why when we define multiply xy, Racket recognizes that multiply is a function that we can call on two variables x and y, and it binds that to multiplying x and y, literally. Okay? So that is it for my little rundown of these two kinds of defines. There is one third kind of define, and that's when you're defining a structure, but that's a little bit more advanced, and we'll get into that in the next video.